Yeah, I'm Jim Schofield, and today I'm going to be speaking on what's the hardest thing timing about async. Um, so a little bit about me. I live in Minnesota in the United States, and I have 5 kids and a dog and a wonderful wife. And I just started using Ember about 2 years ago when I switched over to working for Crowdstrike. So that's part of my talk is I'm new here. I used to be working in React and Vue. And so my background is jQuery, React, Vue, and getting used to Ember was uh, it took some work. There's all these things in Ember, especially now because we're doing this transition to Octane and Glimmer and Embroider and resources, and there's so many things to learn. And not only do you have to learn them, but you have to know what's old and what's new. So what I do at my job is I am creating components that can be placed anywhere in the application. And because they're placed anywhere in the application, they have to do their own data loading. And I can't rely on the model. Um, I have become very acquainted with the Fetch API, and I use it all the time. And the first thing that people tell me when I talk about this is, well, yeah, you just fetch it in the root. I wish I could, and sometimes there's instances where you just can't. My components have to rely on just being placed anywhere and fetching what they need. They don't have access to the model in the root. So this is a story of Jim saying, I think I know how to do that. That's easy. And with the confidence of a relatively experienced programmer, I set forth to figure out how am I going to handle all these fetches at the component level. So when I first started on this whole experience, I I really love the Ember documentation. It does a really great job. I went from 0 to Ember in just a couple of months, and it was very seamless. Um, in Vue and React, I was used to making asynchronous calls at the component level. And so I assumed, Ember has something for that. And so looking in the documentation, we saw they pointed out, if you need to call a method when a component renders, try render modifiers. And so I started reading through the render modifiers documentation, and I encountered this. We strongly encourage you to take this opportunity to rethink your functionality rather than using these modifiers as a crutch. And so I started thinking about modifiers and I started wondering, is this really where I want to be kicking off network requests? Because if you really think about it, that div, that poor div is doing a whole lot of work, and it is just a div. It has nothing to do with whatever incredibly important thing we need to kick off on the network. So I started heading into the wonderful world of creating fetches inside the components. And so my first attempt here was to just do it in the constructor. It's kind of nice that we can just do it in the constructor. It's regular JavaScript. And so here's my first attempt. I'm fetching a dad joke. So in this class, I've created this async method that awaits a dad joke, and then I store it either in a tracked property, or if I get an error, I store that in another tracked property. And then I just call it in the constructor. It seems to work pretty well. So here's proof, video proof that my jokes do come in. If I reload the page, it starts to load, and then a joke appears on the page. Hooray, that's great. But I still had some questions. Am I going to have to write this boilerplate in every component? What if I need to pass special information and then have it fetch? What if that special information, like a joke ID here, changes? Maybe it's an argument to the component. And what happens if a fetch is on root and I want to abort it? What then? Because I'm not handling any of these cases. And this is about the point where I was thinking, oh, maybe I should just use, Ember concurrency or something. And so I didn't, and I chose to just create my own vanilla implementation. And I called it a fetch helper or a promise helper, promise handler. Naming is hard. So here, whoa, sorry, my mouse just scrolled up. Here we have what I was originally trying to do in the beginning was first, let's separate this from the component. So now I have a promise handler that basically houses all the stuff I wanted to do at the component level, but I don't have to do in every component. So here we create a new promise handler, pass in the promise, and we attach it as this fetch handler property. And then I just access the stuff from that property. And this works relatively well. I have video proof that this works, and I actually wrapped it in a toggle to show that it works. And then if you tear it down and then reinstate it, it keeps working. But this brings up a good question. One of the next things I want to tackle is, well, what if I was to click the toggle button 5 times really quickly? What would happen to all those fetches en route? And the answer is right now they are just unhandled. So we have these questions. Can I handle a teardown? Again, I still have these questions about what if I need to pass information and then have network requests respond to that information. And I am not going to sit here and preach about aborting fetches and network requests. I think all I would say is we didn't always have nice things like the abort controller. This is actually pretty recent. And we should, if we attach events, event handlers, we should clean up event handlers. So same with our fetches, we should clean up after ourselves. So here is the big problem. My promise handler is a class. It's not an Ember component. And so Ember doesn't really have any sense that this thing exists. And worse, it's stored on a component that is going to be destroyed eventually. So how do I wire these things up so that that promise handler can react to Ember tearing things down? And thus we can cancel the fetch. So here is my next iteration. I found that there is support for this sort of thing in the Ember documentation. There is this thing called Ember destroyable. And so in my promise handler, what I do is the only thing really that I change is that I'm adding this abort controller, passing that signal along with my promise, and then I'm registering a destructor on this class. And I'm doing that in the constructor. So basically, whenever this thing were to be torn down, this would run and it would abort anything that's in flight. There is an additional thing you have to do over in the class, though. You have to associate a destroyable child, which my understanding is if this component gets torn down, tear this child down as well, or run any destructor functions that have been registered. So more video proof that this works. If I toggle, everything works as intended. And if I toggle off and the component tears down, we see this console log because that was also in my teardown function. So if something was in flight, now we have a mechanism for the promise to be aborted. Okay, for some reason, videos play twice. Okay, great. But what will happen if arguments change? We still haven't answered this kind of last concern. We want it to be able to react to Ember changing, or data changing. So I landed on my 4th attempt here, my 4th iteration, and this, I claim this is where it goes off the rails. This is not great, but for the sake of motivating my final conclusion, here's proof it works. We have this input, I start typing a word, and it will start loading data, and all the while, if it happens quickly, it will actually cancel in-flight fetches. All right, so how did this happen? Okay, first of all, instead of storing fetch handler as a property, I'm kind of cheating and doing a getter. And I'm using this at cache property. It used to be a polyfill not long ago, but I believe now that we can just take it off of Glimmer tracking. And the reason for this is I want this computed property to run when arguments change. So now we have kind of a hook for things to react. The next ugly thing that we've added here is that I created my own kind of manual cache. So if I create a promise handler, I don't want to have to tear down and keep recreating the same promise handler. Instead, if this promise handler exists, I run update on that promise handler instance. And in this case, I called it a resource. Spoiler alert. And then, so if it doesn't have a new resource, I set it. Otherwise, I call modify. And so this is now the promise handler. And the new thing that's in all this mess is update. So if it's already existing, my component will call update here, clear the value, clear the error, handle any in-flight fetches, and then do a new fetch with a new search term. Okay, I didn't feel great about this because I'm not sure that I'm using everything correctly. I'm not sure about all the edge cases. I just wasn't sure. But luckily, Ember is starting to move into this world that includes resources. And talking with Yehuda Katz, this is kind of where things are going for this type of thing. Like if we need to package up some sort of functionality and use it everywhere, this is what we can turn to. So the first thing that I tried was Ember could get used to this. You probably have seen this. It's the first thing I ever encountered that answered this question. And it has in it a class that you can just extend. And in that class, you have these kind of lifecycle hooks. So for us, it maps very nicely. The setup goes to the constructor. The update is the update, and teardown is just like registering a destructor. So here's my attempt 5 when I finally went to a package or something that someone else had already developed. This is almost identical to the thing that I had before, except a few changes. The way arguments come in is a little different. And there's a teardown function instead of registering destructor, but it works. And the other thing in the component is that in this implementation, you use the @useDecorator. Don't worry too much about named and positional argument stuff. There's a reason for that. Life is a lot easier when you're not trying to roll your own everything. So there's a related really cool thing with this implementation of resources is that dad joke helper, whatever we call it, is automatically a template helper that we can call in that implementation. So this actually works without a component class. We call dad joke helper, it gives us data back. So here's a bonus, attempt number 6, and this is actually one of the first things that I found. Big shout out to Nullvox Populi for helping me through this world. He has created this Ember resources you can use today. And this is an example of a tracked function. A tracked function is basically a function that will create resources for you and then manage them for you. And it's all reactive. So you can see a lot of the same things that I was doing before. I was able to fit into this one asynchronous function. And then it gets stored on this joke resource property as value. So again, we're kind of moving to this world where we're able to take this thing, and if we wanted to, we could put it in a different file and then hook it in using tracked function. And if you look at his work here, he has lots of other things that you can use, including like use resource, use function, and so on. And it has its own resource class that you might choose to look into. What I think is really cool is this is very close to what we ended up in my bespoke promise handler. We have a constructor with a register destructor. And instead of update, we have modifier here. So I think it's kind of cool how it kind of converged there. Another cool thing is that this seems to be the future of Polaris. If you wanted to, Yehuda has shared this. He's working on Polaris right now, and he has this website kind of outlining his hopes and vision for Polaris and what's going to happen next. And in there, you can see that resources are going to play a pretty big role. In this case, this is just, I guess, a sketch of what it might look like. It looks very close to the tracked property that we saw from Ember resources. And I guess what I'm saying is that although we know where we want to go, we don't quite know exactly what the API is going to end up shaping. We don't quite know what it's going to look like exactly, but we have a pretty good idea of where some of these things are going to fall. And just another cool thing I wanted to share, if you look at under routes, there's this note here. The idea is to turn a route into a component that gets params from the router, turn the model hook into a resource that returns async data. What we're seeing is that we might be moving into a world, possibly, where it's going to be more component-based and more resource or asynchronous data based instead of relying on the root model as much. But again, this is all sketches, so I am not sure where this is going to land. Okay, so I hope through this talk, I went kind of quick, but I hope I convinced y'all that this is a really good way to reuse code. And it's kind of like React hooks. It allows you to package things up and reuse them broadly. It allows for really good composition. We can hook into things like construction and destruction updates, not just inside of a component. It's a lot shorter to write, and I think it's the future. So again, I'm Jim Schofield. You could follow me on Twitter. I'm not sure why you'd want to, but you can. And then this is a really old website, jscof.com. I've stored all of the examples that I just showed you into a repo, Ember Europe Q2 2022, just rolls off the tongue. So if you want to pull that down, and if you wanted to see kind of the things I was playing with, that's totally available.
Thanks, Jim, for the talk. Really interesting. And we do have 2 questions. How do you feel about Ember versus React? What do you like and dislike in Ember in comparison to React, I guess?
Yeah, I go back and forth on this, and I talk to a lot of people about this because React never claims to be a framework, but people treat it to be one. You end up pulling in tons of different opinionated things along with React. And the one thing I really liked with Ember was that if you wanted to do whatever, there are established ways to do that. I kind of actually relate Ember to Next, because Ember has a lot better help and guardrails around architecting routes, architecting like your entire app. And so I like the idea that Ember has a lot more opinions. Also, I like the idea that Ember is trying to be, I think I've heard it said as like HTML first, or it's trying to stick with a lot of the native stuff that we get.
Yeah, great, cool. I think the opinions and sort of the time we all save is probably what many people value about Ember. I think the second question is kind of an obvious one. What's your favorite dad joke?
Probably one of my favorites is, you know what they say about cliffhangers.
Yeah, that's a good one. I would be excited to hear the answer, but it's a good joke. Cool, great. So another round of applause for Jim.